In text analysis, once you've got a set of data you're interested in, you often need to look at it from multiple angles and to compare it with other subsets. In this video, I'll show you how to use WordSeer to do those things. Remember the dataset we're using here. It's a collection of all the New York Times editorials about China and Japan published over the last 3 decades. That's around 5,000 editorials. In this video, let's start with a specific question, which is, how did perceptions of China change over the 3 decades from 1980 to the present? For this, we're going to have to do some comparisons between editorials from the different decades. We'll see how to do that in this video. Okay, so using the search bar, like in video 2, I've created a search for China. But that's just one search. How do we make 2 more searches for the 3 decades? We split the view into 2 more panes using the split button here. This makes a new blank panel. So now we can just use a search bar to search within it. Notice how the old panel is grayed out? That means it's not active. So when we search, it's going to search into the active panel, which is this new one. So see how it fills in the new panel with the search for China? The same way, I'm going to do that again for a 3rd panel. 1 panel for each decade. We're going to filter them next. Okay, so now we have 3 panels, each with a search for China. Now let's filter each one to a different decade so we can compare how China was talked about in the 3 different decades. We'll start with the first panel and filter that to the 80s. Remember how to do that? We use the metadata panel like this. First, open up that filter. It's a numerical filter, so you have to use the range. Now we'll filter to just the 80s by dragging the slider and clicking filter. Alright, let's do the same for the other panels. So I'm doing the same for the 90s, 1990 to 1999, and then for the 2000s. Now we're ready to compare. Looking at the overviews at the bottom of the frequent phrases in the different decades, some things immediately stand out. For example, United States is top in the 80s and the 2000s, but in the 90s it actually ranks 3rd behind human rights in Hong Kong. In the 80s, it's also mostly equally mentioned with the Soviet Union. It's 138 and 139. So that means there's a lot of talk going on about the Cold War in sentences about China. Whereas in the 90s, there's much more US-China politics. There's mention of things like China leaders and Clinton administration and Clinton himself. But in the 2000s, there are much more global terms: world trade, international relations, United Nations, economic growth, trade surplus. It's a very different picture from the 80s, a very different set of phrases. And remember, these are specifically sentences that mention the word China. Looking at the words, there are some interesting trends there too. Look at economic. It drops from 315 in the 2000s to 297 to just 98 in the 80s. And world drops from 509 in the 2000s to 317 in the 90s, and then down to just 128 in the 80s. This paints a picture of China transitioning from something only talked about in relation to the Cold War to a global economic power in its own right. In this segment, we've seen how to open up multiple views of different data and compare them. In the next segment, we'll see how to get different views of the same data so we can look at it from different angles.